My daughter tried to force me to sell the farm my late wife and I built over 31 years. When I refused, she slapped me to the floor and trashed the place. That night, I quietly made a phone call. The next morning, she walked downstairs and sneered, "Your old dad face reality." Just then, the front door opened. Two police officers and federal agents walked in. The smile vanished from my daughter's face, leaving her dead pale. "Thank you for stopping by, Dad's Revenge Stories. I truly appreciate your support. Tell me in the comments, which city or country are you watching this from? Please note, this story contains dramatized elements created for educational and storytelling purposes. Similarities to actual names or locations are entirely coincidental, yet the core lesson is well worth your time. The ice pack had gone warm 20 minutes ago, but I kept holding it against my cheek anyway. Not because it helped anymore, just because I needed something to hold. The kitchen clock above the stove read 11:43. Outside, the Vermont night was the way it always gets in early October of 2025. Absolute and cold, the kind of dark that settles into the fields and doesn't apologize for itself. I'd lived on this land for 31 years. I knew every sound it made at every hour. Tonight, it was quiet in a way that felt wrong, the way a room goes quiet after something breaks inside it. There were three things on the floor in front of me. A cracked phone screen, the glass splintered from corner to corner like a frozen river. A photograph of Nora, the one I kept on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, the one taken the summer we drove up to Lake Champlain. And she laughed so hard at something I said that she nearly dropped her ice cream cone. The photo had a boot print across her face now. A partial one, the toe of a shoe, pressed right across her smile. And scattered beside it, a handful of the small wooden letters we used to leave on the refrigerator door when Julian was little. She'd arrange them into words every morning before school. "Good morning, Daddy. I love you. Hi." I don't know why those letters had been on the counter. I don't know why I'd kept them all these years after Nora passed. I suppose some things stay in a house the way a person's voice stays in a room. You don't notice it's there until something happens to make the silence wrong. Julian had arrived at 8:30. I'd heard her truck on the gravel before I saw the headlights, and I remember thinking, "Good, she's coming for dinner," she said she might. I put on a second pot of coffee and set 2 mugs out. She didn't want coffee. She sat down at the kitchen table across from me with her coat still on, which should have been the first sign. Julian always took her coat off when she came home. Always. 34 years, every single time she walked through that door, off came the coat. Tonight she kept it on like she wasn't planning to stay. "Dad," she said, "I need to talk to you about the property." I told her we could talk about anything she wanted. I meant it. I always meant it with Julian. What followed was 40 minutes of words that had clearly been practiced. She talked about Derek's investment opportunities, about liquidity, about how a man my age shouldn't have so much tied up in land and a farmhouse when the market was what it was. She talked about how they could find me something smaller, something easier to maintain. A nice condo, maybe somewhere with a community other people my age. She said Derek knew a developer who had been asking about this area. She said it would be a good time to sell. I listened to all of it without interrupting. That's how Nora raised me, to listen fully all the way through before I opened my mouth. When Julian finished, I looked at her across that table and I said quietly, and without anger, "No." That was the moment her voice changed. "Dad, you're not being reasonable." Her jaw tightened in a way I recognized the way it had tightened when she was 16, and I wouldn't let her take the car out in a snowstorm. Except she wasn't 16 anymore, and this wasn't about a car. This land belonged to your mother and me for 31 years, I said. And my answer is no. She pushed her chair back. You're being stubborn and selfish, and Derek has been more than patient with. I'm not selling Julian. She reached across the table and grabbed my phone, just picked it right up like it was hers, like the things on this table belonged to her, and I stood up, startled, and said her name. She turned toward the window with the phone in her hand, and I stepped around the table toward her, reaching for it. And that's when she spun around. Her open palm caught me across the left side of my face with a crack that rang through the whole kitchen. I grabbed the counter with both hands. The pain was immediate and bright, the kind that shoots up behind your eye and makes your vision swim for a second. I was aware of the refrigerator against my back, the cold handle of a cabinet drawer pressing into my hip. I heard the phone hit the floor. I heard her say something low and tight, the words barely making it through the ringing in my ear, something about how I would regret this, how I was making things harder than they needed to be. Then she was gone. The back door hit the frame behind her so hard the window pane rattled. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. I don't know exactly how long. My legs felt strange, not weak exactly, just unsteady, like the ground had shifted an inch to the left, and nobody had told me. I looked at the floor and saw Nora's photograph, lying face up, that boot print across her smile, and something moved through me that I still don't have a clean word for. Not rage. Deeper than rage. The kind of feeling that comes when you understand that something you loved has been gone for longer than you knew. I bent down slowly, my knees aren't what they used to be, and picked the photograph up. I carried it to the kitchen sink and ran cold water over a dish towel and wiped the boot print away as carefully as I could. Then I dried it with the corner of my flannel shirt and set it back on the windowsill where it belonged. Nora smiled up at me the same way she always had. Patient. Like she was waiting for me to figure something out. I pulled the landline off the wall and dialed from memory. Raymond Holt picked up on the second ring. I could hear the television in the background, the low murmur of whatever late news program he watched before bed. He'd been doing that since his wife passed, keeping the TV on, he told me once, so the house didn't feel so large. Raymond, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I need you to come out here tomorrow morning, early. A pause. Not hesitation. Raymond never hesitated. Just the pause of a man who heard something in a friend's voice and was deciding how much to ask right now versus how much to wait for morning. I'll be there by 7, he said. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat back down at the kitchen table with the warm ice pack against my face and waited for the night to pass. Raymond Holt pulled into my driveway at 6:58 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was standing at the kitchen window when his headlights swept across the yard, and the clock on the microwave read 6:58 in green digits that seemed too bright for that hour. I had been up since 4. Not pacing, not worrying, just sitting at the table with a mug of coffee that went cold, and then got replaced, and went cold again, listening to the farm wake up the way it did every morning, slow and without ceremony. Raymond's truck was a dark blue Ford F-150, same model he'd driven for the past 6 years. He parked it beside the barn, the way he always did when he came out here, leaving the driveway, clear out of a habit so old neither of us had ever commented on it. He climbed out slowly. Raymond had a bad hip that he refused to have looked at, which was the stubbornest thing about a man who was otherwise the most reasonable person I had ever known, and he stood beside his truck for a moment, looking at the farmhouse the way you look at something you're glad is still standing. I opened the back door before he reached the porch steps. He came inside, stomped the mud off his boots on the mat Nora had put there 30 years ago, and looked at my face. Not at me, at my face. His eyes moved to the left side of my jaw, to the swelling that had gone from sharp pain to a dull, persistent ache overnight, and something shifted behind his expression. Not surprise. Raymond Holt was not a man who showed surprise easily. Something quieter than that. The kind of recognition that comes when you've been waiting for the worst version of something to finally arrive. I didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say anything at all, not right away. He just pulled out the chair across from mine. The same chair he'd been sitting in for 40 years, at this same table in this same kitchen, and he sat down. I poured him a cup of coffee. He wrapped both hands around the mug and waited. She came at 8:30, I said, with a plan. Derek's plan. I think, though, she'd practiced it well enough that it sounded like her own. I told him about the 40 minutes of talk about liquidity and developers and condos for men my age. I told him about the moment I said no and watched her face change. I told him about the phone and the photograph of Nora and the crack of her palm against my jaw. I said all of it the same way I'd said it to myself 100 times, between midnight and sunrise, straightforwardly, without drama, because the facts were dramatic enough on their own, without me adding anything to them. Raymond listened the way he always listened, with his full attention and his mouth shut. It was one of the things I had appreciated most about him for 4 decades. He never rushed to fill the space where your words had just been. When I finished, he set his mug down and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a small green notebook, the kind you could buy at any hardware store, spiral-bound with a water-resistant cover, and placed it on the table between us. Then he uncapped a pen and looked at me. "Tell me again," he said. "From the beginning. Everything she said and everything she did in the order it happened." I understood then what kind of visit this was. Raymond hadn't driven down from Burlington at dawn because he wanted to comfort an old friend over coffee. He had driven down because I had asked him to, and because he knew the way he always seemed to know things before I said them directly, that what I needed was not comfort. What I needed was a witness. I told him everything again. He wrote in his notebook with the careful, unhurried handwriting of a man who had spent his career understanding that the difference between the truth and a distorted version of it often came down to which details someone remembered to write down. When I finished the second telling, he asked 3 questions. What time did she arrive? What time did she leave? And had anyone else been present? I answered all 3. He capped his pen and looked at the notebook for a moment. Then he looked at me. "Edward," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before Julian gets here." He paused, and in 40 years of friendship, I had learned that when Raymond Holt paused before a sentence, the sentence mattered. "Derek Moss. You said that's his name." "That's his name. I know that name." Raymond's voice was level, but his jaw had tightened in a way I had only seen a handful of times in the years when he was still on the bench, and something in a courtroom had genuinely offended him. 8 years ago, I presided over a fraud case in Chittenden County. A family. The father was 71 years old. His daughter's boyfriend had convinced her to help him transfer assets out of the old man's name. Started with a power of attorney, ended with the man losing his house. He let that sit for a moment. The boyfriend's name was Derek Moss. He walked because the evidence wasn't sufficient for conviction. I have thought about that case more times than I can count. The kitchen felt very still around us. "He walked," I said. "He walked." Raymond picked up his mug. "He's not going to walk twice." Outside, the morning light was coming up gray and thin over the east field, the way Vermont light comes in October, cautious and non-committal, like it isn't sure yet how much of itself to offer. I heard gravel crunch at the end of the driveway. We both turned toward the window at the same time. Julian's truck rolled slowly up the drive, and stopped beside Raymond's Ford. Raymond looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us reached for our coffee. "She's early," he said. "She's always been early when she wants something," I said. Julian came through the back door the same way she had come through it her entire life without knocking, because this was her father's house, and she had never needed to knock. She was wearing a gray wool coat I hadn't seen before, her dark hair pulled back, her face composed in the particular way it got when she had decided in advance how a conversation was going to go. She stopped 2 steps inside the kitchen. Raymond was sitting at the table with his green notebook open in front of him and his coffee mug in his right hand, watching her the way he watched everything steadily, without urgency, like a man who had spent decades listening to people say things they would later wish they hadn't. "Dad." Julian's eyes moved from Raymond to me and back again. "I didn't know you had company." "Raymond drove down this morning," I said. "Sit down, Julian. Have some coffee." She didn't sit. She stayed where she was near the door, and something moved across her face that I recognized as recalculation. She had come here with a script, and Raymond's presence wasn't in it. "I was hoping we could talk privately," she said. Raymond set his mug down and folded his hands on the table. "Julian, I've known your father for 40 years. I think he'd want me here for this conversation. But I want you to know I'm not here as a judge. I'm here as his friend. There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she pulled out the chair at the end of the table, the one that had been Nora's, and sat down without taking off her coat. "Fine," she said. I poured her a cup of coffee and set it in front of her. She didn't touch it. Raymond spoke first, and he did it the way he did everything in a room where something important was at stake, quietly, without performance, choosing each word like he was placing it somewhere it needed to stay. He told her that what had happened the night before in this kitchen was serious. Not just as a matter between a father and daughter, but as a legal matter. In the state of Vermont, he said physically striking an elderly person, and he used the word elderly plainly, without apology, constituted elder abuse under Title 13 of the Vermont statutes, a criminal offense that carried real consequences. He told her this not to threaten her, but because he believed she deserved to understand exactly where she was standing. Julian's jaw tightened. "I lost my temper. That's not the same as—" "It is the same," Raymond said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "The law doesn't distinguish between a momentary loss of control and an intentional act when it comes to physical harm. What matters is what happened, not what you meant to happen." She turned to me then, and her expression shifted into something I hadn't seen on her face since she was a teenager. A kind of desperate appeal, the look of someone who realizes the ground is less solid than they thought. "Dad, can we please just talk about this between us without—" She gestured toward Raymond. "All of this." I looked at my daughter across Nora's kitchen table. I looked at the coat she hadn't taken off. I thought about the photograph on the windowsill and the boot print I had wiped away in the dark. "Julian," I said, "I love you. I have loved you every day of your life, and I will love you every day of whatever life I have left. That is not in question." I kept my voice even because I meant every word, and I didn't want the meaning lost in the delivery. "But I need you to understand something. Last night you came into this house and you put your hands on me. You put your foot on a photograph of your mother, and you walked out that door without looking back." I paused. "I am giving you the chance right now to tell me that you understand what you did. That's all I'm asking." The kitchen was quiet, except for the sound of the furnace cycling on in the basement, that low, reliable hum that had been the background noise of this house for 20 years. Julian looked at the coffee mug in front of her. Her fingers moved toward the handle and then stopped. Derek thinks. I'm not asking you what Derek thinks, I said. I'm asking what you think. Something flickered across her face. For just a moment, less than a second, the length of a breath, I thought I saw the girl who used to arrange wooden letters on the refrigerator door every morning before school. Then it was gone. She stood up. You're both ganging up on me in my own father's kitchen, and you're acting like I'm the problem here. Her voice had gone tight and brittle the way it got when she felt cornered. Derek is trying to help this family. He's trying to help you whether you can see that or not. And all you're doing is making enemies out of people who care about you. She pushed her chair back and picked up her purse. Julian. Raymond's voice stopped her at the door. Think carefully about what happens next. Whatever Derek has told you is coming, it isn't. And when you figure that out, I hope it isn't too late to make a different choice. She opened the back door. The cold came in for a moment, sharp and clean, the smell of October fields and wet leaves. Then the door closed and she was gone. Through the window. Above the sink, I watched her cross the yard to her truck. She had her phone. Before she reached the driver's door, her fingers moving fast across the screen, her head bent. She wasn't calling anyone. She was texting. Whoever was on the other end of that phone, she needed to tell them something right now, before she'd even started the engine. I turned away from the window. She's going straight back to him, I said. Raymond had picked up his pen. I know. He wrote something in the notebook, capped the pen, and looked at me. Edward, how long have you actually known something was wrong? Not last night. Before last night. I sat back down at the table and wrapped my hands around my coffee mug. Outside, I heard Julian's truck back out onto the road. 3 months, I said. Maybe a little more. Raymond looked at me steadily, waiting. The way he always waited. There are some things I need to tell you, I said. Raymond didn't rush me. That was the thing about him. He had spent 40 years on the bench listening to people tell stories that mattered, and he understood that the ones that mattered most couldn't be hurried. He refilled his coffee from the pot on the counter, sat back down, and opened his notebook to a fresh page. Then he looked at me and waited. I told him it started with a piece of mail. It came on a Tuesday morning in mid-July, mixed in with the electric bill and a seed catalog I hadn't ordered. A letter from a finance company in Burlington I had never heard of, addressed to me by name, thanking me for my continued business and reminding me that my account balance of $42,000 was due for its monthly minimum payment. I read it 3 times, standing at the mailbox at the end of the driveway, before I walked back to the house and sat down at the kitchen table to read it a 4th time. I did not have an account with this company. I had never borrowed $42,000 from anyone. I had not had a loan of any kind since Nora and I paid off the farm mortgage 18 years ago, and we had thrown a small party in this kitchen the night we made the final payment, because Nora said any debt worth carrying for 20 years was worth celebrating when it was done. I called Tom Whitfield that same afternoon. Tom was 55, worked in consumer lending at a credit union in Montpelier, and had been a friend of mine since our sons played Little League together in the early 90s. I trust him the way you trust someone who has no reason to be anything other than straight with you. I told him what the letter said and asked him what I should do. He told me to sit tight and let him make some calls. He called me back the next morning. His voice had the careful quality of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have. 3 accounts, he said. Not one. 3 separate finance companies across Vermont and New Hampshire, all opened within the past 14 months, all using my name, my social security number, my home address. Combined balance just under $180,000. Raymond's pen stopped moving. He looked up at me. He used your social security number. And my address, I said. and my date of birth. Everything he needed was on a piece of mail that came through this box. I nodded toward the driveway. Or he found it somewhere else. Tom said it didn't matter how he got it. What mattered was what he'd done with it. Identity fraud, Tom had explained, was a federal offense under 18 U.S.C. Section 1028, which meant it wasn't just a matter for local police. It gave federal investigators jurisdiction. It also meant that whatever Derek Moss had built using my name, the paper trail would be thorough and traceable in ways that purely local crimes sometimes weren't. I had written that statute number down on a notepad and looked it up that same night. Raymond was writing steadily. "What did you do after Tom called?" "I drove to Burlington and met with a lawyer," I said. "A woman named Patricia Cross, who Tom recommended. She spent 2 hours with me going through everything, and then told me I had 3 options: report immediately, wait and gather more evidence, or do both in sequence." I looked at my coffee mug. She recommended the third option. So did I once I thought it through. If I reported immediately, Derek would know I knew. Whatever he was planning, he'd adjust or disappear. I needed him to keep moving forward. After the lawyer, I had called Deputy Carol Stein at the local sheriff's substation. Carol was 42, had been with the department for 16 years, and was the kind of officer who wrote thorough reports and didn't make promises she couldn't keep. I'd met her 3 years ago when someone cut the fence on the east side of the property and helped themselves to 2 of my older ewes. She'd found them. I trusted her judgment. I told her everything I had told the lawyer and asked her what the department could do if I came to them with documented evidence rather than a suspicion. She told me to build the file and come back when it was ready. Then I came home and installed cameras. Vermont was a one-party consent state, meaning that a person could legally record any conversation they were a party to without notifying the other participants. I was the owner of this house and this land. Any conversation that took place on this property, I was effectively a party to. I bought 3 small cameras from a hardware store in Stowe, the kind marketed for home security, nothing. Elaborate, and mounted them in the kitchen, the front hallway, and the living room. I ran the feeds to a laptop I kept in the locked filing cabinet in the bedroom. "You did all of this alone," Raymond said. It wasn't a question. "I didn't want Julian to know I knew," I said. "If she found out, she'd tell Derek, and Derek would stop." I paused. I needed Derek to keep going. Raymond set his pen down and looked at me across the table with an expression I had seen only a few times in 40 years, a kind of careful, appraising respect. The look of a man reassessing something he thought he already understood. "Edward, you've been sitting on this for 3 months alone, and you didn't say a word to anyone." "I said a word to Tom," I said, "and to Patricia Cross, and to Carol Stein. You know what I mean." I did know what he meant. "I needed to be sure," I said. "Before I did anything that couldn't be undone, I needed to be absolutely certain. And I needed enough to make it stick." I looked at him directly. "The last time Derek Moss stood in front of a judge, he walked out. I was not going to let that happen again." Raymond picked up his pen and held it without writing. Outside, the morning had brightened to a flat gray that suggested cloud cover moving in from the northwest. Classic Vermont, the sky, making its intentions clear only after it had already decided. He tapped the pen once against the notebook and then looked up. "You said you needed one more thing," he said. "When we spoke on the phone last night, you said you just needed one more thing." "I need them to come here," I said, "with their paperwork and their plan. I need it all to happen on this property, on camera, in front of witnesses." I looked at the window. "Last night, Julian gave me that. She just doesn't know it yet." I got up from the table and went to the back bedroom. There was a filing cabinet beside the window. a four-drawer gray steel unit that had been in this house since before Julian was born. Nora used to call it the ugly gray monster and threaten every few years to replace it with something that didn't look like it belonged in a government office. But she never did because she also understood the way she understood most practical things more clearly than I did that ugly and reliable were not mutually exclusive qualities. I unlocked the bottom drawer with a key I kept on my main ring and pulled out a brown accordion folder held shut with a rubber band. I carried it back to the kitchen and set it on the table between Raymond and me. "This is what they're actually after," I said. I pulled out a packet of papers held together with a binder clip, the operating documents for Callaway Land Holdings, LLC, filed with the Vermont Secretary of State's office 22 years ago. I set it in front of Raymond and let him look at the first page while I explained. When Nora and I had bought this property, we had purchased it not in our personal names, but through a limited liability company we formed specifically for that purpose. It was Patricia Cross's predecessor at the same firm, a lawyer named Gerald Webb, who had suggested it. The structure meant that the farm and the house were owned by the LLC, not by Edward and Nora Callaway as individuals. Our personal names did not appear on the property deed. What appeared there was Callaway Land Holdings, LLC. The practical effect of that, I said, is that Julian and Derek cannot force the sale of this property through any legal action directed at me personally. A judgment against Edward Callaway doesn't touch assets owned by Callaway Land Holdings. The company is a separate legal entity. To get at the farm, they would need to pierce the corporate veil, which requires proving fraud or misuse of the LLC structure, neither of which applies here. Raymond had been reading while I talked. He turned to the second page without looking up. "Who are the members of the LLC?" "Originally Nora and me equally," I said. 50% each. I reached into the folder and pulled out a second document, a single-page handwritten amendment to the original operating agreement, witnessed and notarized. When Nora was diagnosed about 8 months before she passed, she amended the operating agreement. Her 50% membership interest upon her death was to transfer not to me and not to Julian, but to the Nora Callaway Garden Fund, a charitable trust she established at the same time through the same lawyer. Raymond took the amendment from me and read it. His expression didn't change, but he went very still in the way he went still when something impressed him. "She set up a charitable trust." "She did. The trust's stated purpose is supporting land conservation and agricultural education programs in Washington County. The trustee is First Vermont Bank, which has been administering it since Nora passed." I set my coffee mug down. "The result is that 50% of this LLC is owned by a charitable trust administered by a bank. I cannot sell this property. Not because I don't want to, because I literally cannot complete a transaction without the trustee's written consent and the trustee's fiduciary obligation to the trust's charitable purpose means they will not consent to a sale that simply converts farmland to residential development." Nora knew that when she wrote it. Raymond set the amendment down on the table and looked at it for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had something in it I didn't hear often. "She did this before she knew any of this was coming. 2 years before Derek Moss ever set foot in my daughter's life," I said. "She told me she wanted to make sure the land stayed the land. That was how she put it." I looked at the windowsill where Nora's photograph sat. "I think she also wanted to make sure I couldn't do something foolish with it if I was ever lonely enough to make a bad decision. She didn't say that part out loud, but I knew what she meant." Raymond almost smiled. "Smart woman. The smartest person I ever knew," I said. "By a considerable distance." He slid both documents back across the table to me, and I returned them to the accordion folder. We sat for a moment with the morning pressing in through the kitchen windows. The cloud cover from the northwest moving in steadily, the way it had been threatening to since Raymond arrived. "So whatever paperwork they've put together," Raymond said, "whatever conservatorship filing Derek has arranged, it doesn't matter. Even if a court were to appoint a guardian for you, which they won't. But even hypothetically, the guardian would have no authority to force the LLC to sell. The trust blocks it." "That's what Patricia Cross told me," I said. "She said the structure Nora built was, and I am quoting her directly here, about as close to bulletproof as real estate law in Vermont gets." Raymond nodded slowly. He picked up his pen, made a note, and then set the pen down again. He was about to say something when my phone buzzed on the table between us. I looked at the screen. An unknown number. A text message 4 lines long. "Mr. Calloway, my name is Dr. Paul Hensley. I am a psychiatrist practicing in Burlington. I believe I have done something seriously wrong, and I need to speak with you as soon as possible. Please call me back at this number. It is urgent." I read it twice. Then I turned the phone around and slid it across the table so Raymond could read it. He read it. He looked up at me. "Does that name mean anything to you?" I asked. "No," he said, "but I think it's about to." I called the number back, while Raymond was still sitting across the table from me. It rang twice before a man answered. His voice was careful in the way that voices get when someone has been rehearsing what to say and is now discovering that the rehearsal didn't cover everything. He confirmed his name was Dr. Paul Hensley, that he was a psychiatrist with a private practice on Williston Road in Burlington, that he had been in practice for 26 years. Then he stopped as though he had arrived at the edge of something and wasn't certain how to step off it. "Dr. Hensley," I said, "whatever you have to tell me, I'd rather hear it in person. Can you come out to the farm today?" A pause. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I think that's right. I'll come this afternoon." He arrived at 2 o'clock in a dark green Volvo that he parked very precisely at the edge of the driveway, the front wheels aligned with the edge of the gravel, as though parking carefully might make what came next easier. I was 58 years old, trim and gray-haired, wearing a sport coat over a collared shirt with no tie. He looked like exactly what he was, a professional man who had made a decision he understood was wrong and had not slept well since. Raymond and I met him at the door. Raymond introduced himself by name only, without title, and I appreciated that. Hensley shook both our hands and came inside and sat at the kitchen table, and I noticed that his hands, when he set them flat on the table in front of him, were not entirely steady. "I'll tell you what happened," he said, "and then I'll answer whatever questions you have." 6 weeks ago, he had been approached by a man named Derek Moss through a mutual professional contact, a colleague Hensley trusted, who had apparently been deceived about the nature of the referral, just as Hensley himself had been. Derek had presented himself as a concerned family member, trying to arrange care for an aging relative who was, in Derek's description, showing significant signs of cognitive decline. He had used the words confused, combative, and unable to manage his own affairs. He had been smooth and credible, and had brought documentation fabricated, as it turned out, that appeared to support his account. Derek had asked Hensley to complete a psychiatric evaluation, and based on that evaluation, to sign a form certifying that Edward Calloway of rural Washington County was cognitively impaired to a degree that warranted court-appointed guardianship. The form, Hensley explained, was a standard Vermont probate court document used in legitimate guardianship proceedings under Title 14 of the Vermont statutes. In legitimate cases, it required a thorough in-person evaluation before it could be completed. Hensley had not conducted an in-person evaluation. He had reviewed the fabricated documentation Derek provided, spoken with Derek twice by phone, and signed the form. Derek had paid him $15,000 in 2 wire transfers. "I want you to understand," Hensley said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word understand before he steadied it, "that I knew it was wrong when I did it. I am not going to sit here and tell you I was deceived into something I didn't recognize. I recognized it. I made a choice for money, and I have not been able to justify that choice to myself since the moment I cashed the first transfer." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing the clouds in faster from the northwest, and the light through the windows had gone from flat gray to the particular dim yellow that comes before rain in Vermont. Raymond leaned forward. "The form, have you filed it with the probate court?" "No." Hensley reached into the inside pocket of his sport coat and produced an envelope. He set it on the table and slid it toward me. "It's in there. Unsigned copy for reference and the signed original. I have not submitted it to anyone. I came here first." I opened the envelope. Inside was the signed form, my name, my address, Hensley's credentials and signature at the bottom, and beneath it, a folded sheet of paper that turned out to be a printed bank statement showing 2 wire transfers, each identified by sender. The sender name on both was D. Moss Consulting, LLC. Raymond looked at this bank statement for a long moment. "Dr. Hensley, would you be willing to provide a written statement describing everything you've just told us, the approach, the documentation, the payment, the form, and to give that statement to law enforcement?" Hensley nodded. His jaw was tight, and his eyes had the reddened look of someone who had been keeping something behind them for too long. "That's why I came," he said. "I can't undo what I agreed to do, but I can make sure it doesn't get used." Raymond took his notebook out and spent 40 minutes taking down Hensley's full account. When he finished, Hensley signed the written statement, and Raymond witnessed it. Then I called Deputy Carol Stein and told her we had a development she needed to know about. She said she would come out first thing in the morning. After Hensley left, Raymond and I sat at the table with the envelope between us. My phone rang. Carol Stein calling back less than 20 minutes after I had spoken to her. "Edward Chisholm," she said. "I just got off with the federal task force contact I've been coordinating with on the identity fraud piece. They ran Derek Moss through their system this afternoon." A pause. "He booked a flight this morning, one way, out of Burlington International, departing in 72 hours. I looked at Raymond across the table. "Then we have 72 hours, I said. Raymond was already reaching for his pen. After Stein's call, Raymond and I sat at the table for a while without touching our coffee. The rain had arrived while Hensley was giving his statement, a steady October rain that came in sideways off the fields and ran down the kitchen windows in thin gray lines. I watched it for a moment, then I got up and went to the bedroom. The laptop was in the locked filing cabinet, bottom drawer, same key as the accordion folder. I carried it out to the kitchen table and opened it and pulled up the camera application. The interface showed 4 thumbnail feeds: kitchen front hallway, living room, and the small mudroom off the back entrance, each with a timestamp running in the lower right corner. 3 months of footage stored on an encrypted external drive plugged into the side of the machine. "There's something I want you to see," I said to Raymond. "From about 6 weeks ago, I navigated to the date, a Saturday in late August, 2 weeks before the first debt collection letter arrived. Derek had come out to the farm that day, ostensibly to help me look at a section of fence on the north pasture that Julian said needed replacing. I had walked the fence line with him for 20 minutes and found nothing wrong with it. Looking back, I understood that had been the point getting me out of the house long enough. I found the timestamp I was looking for and pressed play. The kitchen camera showed the room empty for 40 seconds after Raymond and I walked out the back door. Then Julian came in from the hallway, and Derek followed her, and Derek crossed immediately to the kitchen window and watched until he apparently satisfied himself that I was far enough away. His back was to the camera. Julian sat down at the table. "How long does he need?" Derek said. His voice was clear on the recording. The cameras had better microphones than I had expected when I bought them. "I don't know. 20 minutes, maybe." Julian's voice was flatter than it sounded in person. Not cold exactly, but diminished like a version of herself with the volume turned down. Derek turned from the window and leaned against the counter. His posture was the posture of a man entirely at ease in a space he had already decided was going to be his. "We need him to sign before the end of the month," he said. "The lender I'm working with has a deadline." "I know that." "Does he know we're serious?" Julian looked at her hands on the table. "He doesn't think anyone's serious. He's never thought anyone was serious about anything that inconveniences him." Derek made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That's fine. Old guys like him, they think being stubborn is the same as being right." He pushed off the counter and walked toward the hallway. "He's got a nice setup out here. Good land, solid house. Somebody's going to get use out of it. Might as well be us." He paused at the hallway entrance and looked back at Julian. "He's not going to be a problem. He's just an old man on a farm who doesn't know what he's got." I reached over and paused the playback. Raymond was looking at the screen. His expression had the particular quality of careful stillness that meant he was managing something he didn't want to let out in the open. He had been a judge for 22 years. He had listened to testimony from people who had done terrible things and kept his face neutral because the law required it. This was different. This was a kitchen table, not a courtroom, and the man on the screen was talking about his friend. "Keep going," he said. I pressed play. The footage continued, Derek moving around the kitchen, opening a cabinet, helping himself to a glass of water from the tap with the ease of a man in his own home. Julian stayed at the table. They talked through timelines, through what documents I would need to sign, and in what order, through what they would do if I said no. Derek's voice stayed even and practical, throughout the voice of someone running through logistics, not discussing a person. Then he said the thing I had watched 4 times now and still felt in my chest each time. "If the old man makes this difficult, we use the doctor's paperwork and we don't ask him anymore. Either way, it ends the same." He set his glass in the sink. "He just doesn't know it yet." Julian said nothing. She turned her face toward the window. I stopped the playback and closed the laptop. The rain was heavier now, drumming against the roof in the steady way it did when it planned to stay for a while. I sat with my hands flat on the table and looked at the closed laptop and thought about the afternoon that footage was taken, how I had walked back in from the fence line and made sandwiches, and the 3 of us had sat at this table eating lunch, and Derek had asked me questions about the history of the property with what I had taken at the time for genuine curiosity. Raymond spoke first. His voice was quieter than usual. "Edward, how many times have you watched?" "Enough," I said. "Enough times to stop being angry about it." He looked at me. "Are you?" I thought about it honestly. "I'm not angry at Derek," I said. "Derek Moss is exactly who he is and has never pretended otherwise, at least not on that recording. What I feel about Derek is something closer to clarity." I looked at the window where the rain was running in long, unbroken lines down the glass. What I feel when I watch Julian sit there and not say a word that I don't have a name for yet. Raymond put his hand briefly on the table near mine, not quite touching, and then pulled it back. He had always understood when words were the wrong tool. After a while I said, "She'll come back tomorrow. He'll send her back with the paperwork." "I know," Raymond said, "and the day after that they'll come together." "Yes." I looked at the closed laptop. I need everything Carol has ready by morning. Raymond reached for his notebook. Then let's make sure it is. She knocked this time. That was the first thing I noticed. Julian, who had been walking through this back door without knocking for 34 years, stood on the porch and knocked. 3 times evenly spaced, the way you knock on a door that belongs to someone else. I was at the kitchen counter when I heard it, and I stood there for a moment with my coffee mug in my hand before I crossed the room and opened the door. She was holding a white bakery box in both hands, tied with the thin red string that the place in Montpellier used, the bakery on Main Street she'd been going to since high school. Maple scones. My favorite, and she knew it. But the morning was gray and damp from last night's rain, the fields dark with wet, the birch trees along the fence line, holding their last few yellow leaves against a sky the color of old pewter. "I thought you might want some breakfast," she said. Her voice was softer than it had been yesterday, carefully softer. And I wanted to apologize. For yesterday. For the way I acted. I stepped back and let her in. She set the bakery box on the counter and then lifted a canvas bag I hadn't noticed she was carrying and began unpacking it onto the kitchen table. A covered casserole dish. A mason jar of the apple butter she knew I spread on toast in the mornings. A smaller container that she said was chicken soup, homemade, still warm. She arranged these things with the deliberate care of someone making a case without words. "You didn't have to do all that," I said. "I wanted to." She turned and looked at me with an expression I recognized from her childhood, the open, earnest look she wore when she was trying very hard to seem like she wasn't trying hard at all. "Dad, I'm sorry about yesterday. I said things I shouldn't have said. I acted in a way I'm not proud of." She stopped. "I just want us to be okay." I told her I appreciated her coming. I meant it, or part of it. I appreciated that she had come because I needed her here. I poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one in front of her, and she sat down at the table. And for a few minutes we talked about nothing in particular, the way you can with someone you've known your whole life, about the rain overnight, and whether the north pasture had drained properly, and whether I'd called the vet about the older of my 2 ewes who'd been off her feed. Then I said the fence post at the back corner of the east field had been bothering me and asked if she'd come take a look at it with me. It was the kind of small domestic request that had been a natural part of our visits for years before things changed. She said of course and pulled her coat back on, and we went out the back door together into the damp, gray morning. We were outside for 11 minutes. I know because I checked the timestamp later. I showed her the fence post, which genuinely needed attention, a split running down the grain about 8 inches from the top. The kind of thing that would fail under snow load if it wasn't replaced before winter. We talked about it. She asked if I wanted her to call someone or if I'd handle it myself. I said I'd handle it. We walked back to the house and I held the door for her, and she went inside ahead of me, and I paused on the porch for a moment, ostensibly to knock the mud off my boots, and looked out at the fields. 11 minutes was enough. When I came inside, Julian was already back at the table with her coffee. The casserole dish was where she'd left it. The mason jar was where she'd left it. Everything looked exactly as it had when we walked out. I sat across from her and reached for my coffee mug. She watched me. There was something in her eyes that wasn't quite anxiety, but was adjacent to it, a heightened attention, the look of someone waiting for a specific thing to happen. I picked up the casserole dish and lifted the lid. It smelled the way her cooking always smelled, like rosemary, and something underneath that was warm and familiar. I took the serving spoon she'd included and put a portion on the plate she had also thought to bring. Then I set the spoon down and looked at the plate. "I'll save this for lunch," I said. "I had a big breakfast earlier, and I'm still not hungry." I replaced the lid. The scones look good, though. I reached for the bakery box. Julian's left hand, resting on the table near her mug, moved slightly, a small, involuntary contraction of the fingers there and gone in less than a second. If I hadn't been watching her hands, I would have missed it. I opened the bakery box and took a scone and ate it, standing at the counter, talking to her about the fence post, about whether the snow was coming early this year, about nothing. She drank her coffee. Gradually, the set of her shoulders eased. Then she reached into her coat pocket and placed a manila envelope on the table. "Dad," she said, "while I'm here, Derek put together some updated paperwork for your supplemental health coverage. He just needs your signature on a couple of forms to make sure everything is current." She pushed the envelope toward me with one finger carefully, like she was sliding a card across a table. "It won't take 5 minutes." I picked up the envelope and turned it over in my hands. It was sealed. My name was written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. "Let me take a look," I said. I carried it to the counter and set it beside the bakery box and picked up my scone again. "I'll read it through tonight when my eyes are better and we can talk about it tomorrow." Julian's coffee mug came down on the table with a sound that was just slightly harder than necessary. "It's really just routine paperwork, Dad. Nothing complicated." "Then it'll keep until tomorrow," I said pleasantly. "More coffee?" Julian said yes to more coffee, which surprised me slightly. I had expected her to leave. Instead, she watched me refill her mug and then wrapped both hands around it the way people do when they need something to hold, and she stayed. I carried the manila envelope to the table and sat back down across from her. I broke the seal with my thumbnail. The way I had opened mail at this table for 30 years and drew out the papers inside. There were 6 pages printed on a computer with a signature line at the bottom of the last page and 2 places marked with small adhesive tabs, the kind that said, "Sign here" in red letters, the kind you bought at any office supply store in Vermont. I smoothed the pages flat and began to read. I had spent 40 years reading technical documents in my work. Engineering schematics, land surveys, construction contracts, equipment specifications. The habit of reading carefully and completely, of not moving to page 2 until page 1 was fully understood, was so deeply ingrained that I did it now without thinking about it. I read every line. When I reached a term I wanted to examine, I stopped and examined it. Julian watched me from across the table. She drank her coffee. She was doing a reasonable job of appearing patient, but I had known her for 34 years, and I could read the tells, the way her thumbnail moved in small, repetitive arcs along the handle of her mug, the way her eyes went to the papers, and then to my face, and then to the window and back again, in a cycle that shortened every few minutes. The document was not what it claimed to be. I understood that from the second page. The language that was supposed to describe supplemental health coverage kept sliding, paragraph by paragraph, into territory that had nothing to do with medical benefits, references to financial accounts, to authorization of transactions, to a scope of representation that extended well beyond anything a legitimate health insurance addendum would require. By the 4th page, it was describing in the careful, indirect language of someone who had worked to make it hard to find, on a quick read, a comprehensive financial power of attorney. The kind that, once signed, would give the named representative identified in the document only as the authorized agent, with a line left blank where the name would presumably be filled in later, the legal authority to act on my behalf in all financial matters. I read it to the end. Then I set the pages down and looked at Julian. "This 4th page," I said. "This section here." I turned the papers so she could see and pointed to the paragraph I meant. "Can you explain what this part means in plain language?" She leaned forward and looked at where I was pointing. "It's just standard legal language. All these forms have that kind of wording. It doesn't really mean anything specific. It mentions financial accounts, I said. Right here and here. I pointed to two places. That seems specific to me. Dad. Her voice had thinned slightly at the edges the way it did when she was working to keep it steady. Derek had a lawyer draw these up. It's all legitimate. I wouldn't bring you something that wasn't legitimate. I looked at her over the tops of the pages. She held my gaze for 3 seconds before her eyes moved to the window. Julianne, I said, I've been signing my name to documents for 50 years. The one thing I learned early and never forgot is that the sentence you don't understand is the one that matters most. I set the pages down and folded my hands on top of them. I'm going to call Patricia Cross this afternoon and ask her to look at this before I sign anything. She's been my lawyer for 6 years. This is exactly the kind of thing I pay her for. The thumbnail stopped moving against the mug handle. You don't need to do that, Julian said. It'll just slow everything down, and Derek has a deadline with the insurance. Then Derek's deadline will have to be flexible, I said. I'm not signing anything a lawyer hasn't reviewed. That's not a negotiation, sweetheart. That's just how I do things. She set her mug down. The sound was controlled this time, deliberate. She had caught herself. She straightened in her chair and looked at me with an expression I recognized as the one she wore when she was recalculating. Fine, she said. Talk to your lawyer. But Dad, please don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. Derek is trying to help. I know he is, I said. She left 10 minutes later. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her cross the yard in long, quick strides, not the measured walk of someone leaving on good terms, but the walk of someone who needed to make a call and couldn't do it soon enough. She had her phone to her ear before she reached the driver's door of her truck. Her free hand moved in short, sharp gestures as she talked, the kind of movements that meant the person on the other end was hearing something they didn't want to hear. I watched until the truck disappeared around the bend in the road. Then I picked up the manila envelope and carried it to the bedroom and placed it in the filing cabinet beside the laptop in the same drawer behind the accordion folder of LLC documents. I locked the drawer and put the key back on my ring. I stood in the bedroom for a moment, with my hand on the top of the filing cabinet, and thought about what was in that cabinet now. 3 months of preparation, Hensley's signed statement, the footage on the encrypted drive, and the document Derek had spent money having drawn up, which was now sitting in my possession rather than carrying my signature. 48 hours, I thought. Maybe less. I went back to the kitchen and called Raymond. Raymond came back out to the farm that afternoon, and we spent 3 hours going through everything with Deputy Stein, who arrived at 4 o'clock in a department vehicle and spread her paperwork across the kitchen table with the organized efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this longer than the meeting had been scheduled. She confirmed the arrest warrants were in process, that Agent Roy Simmons from the Federal Task Force would be on site by 7 the following morning, and that the footage from the camera system, which I had transferred to a separate drive and given to her the previous evening, had been reviewed and logged as evidence. When they left at 7, I stood at the kitchen counter looking at the containers Julian had brought. Deputy Stein had taken samples earlier that afternoon, and her call 20 minutes ago confirmed what I had already suspected. The soup contained a prescription-grade sedative compound, the exact kind that would produce the confusion and disorientation described in Hensley's fraudulent paperwork. I carefully sealed the container, marked it for Stein's evidence locker, and made myself a simple piece of toast instead. Then I was alone. The farm at night in October had a particular quality of stillness that I had lived inside for 31 years, and still could not entirely describe. It was not quiet. The wind moved through the tree line along the north fence. The old house settled and creaked in the way old houses do. The animals in the barn made their small, intermittent sounds. But underneath all of that, there was something that felt like held breath, like the land itself was waiting for something. I went to the bedroom and took the photograph of Nora from the nightstand, not the one from the kitchen windowsill, but the one I kept beside the bed, the smaller one taken the winter before she was diagnosed. The two of us standing outside the barn, in 6 inches of snow, laughing at something neither of us could remember afterward. I sat on the edge of the bed with the photograph in my hands and looked at her face for a long time. We had been married for 41 years when she died. 41 years was long enough that I had stopped being able to clearly identify where my own habits ended and hers began, the way she had taught me to notice what people did with their hands when they were nervous. The way she had made me understand that patience was not the same as passivity. The way she used to say that the most dangerous thing a person could do was convince themselves that what they wanted and what was right were the same thing. That last one, I thought, was Julian's problem. Had been for a while now. I set the photograph back on the nightstand and reached under the bed for the flat cedar box I kept there. Inside was the envelope, cream-colored, letter-sized, Nora's handwriting on the front. For Julian, when she needs it. I had looked at those words so many times in 2 years that they had stopped looking like words and started looking like a shape I had memorized. I turned the envelope over in my hands without opening it. Nora had given it to me on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, 8 days before she died. She had been in bed most of that week, tired in the way that went beyond sleep, and I had been sitting beside her reading aloud from a novel she liked. She had reached out and put her hand on my arm and asked me to stop reading for a minute. Then she had asked me to get the envelope from the top drawer of her dresser. She pressed it into my hands and looked at me with the directness she had kept even when everything else was going. She said, "Don't open this. It isn't for you." She almost smiled when she said it. "You'll know when to give it to her. I trust you to know." I had wanted to ask her what was in it. I had not asked. There were things Nora understood about Julian that I had never been able to see as clearly, and I had learned over 41 years that when Nora told me she trusted me to know something, she was also telling me to stay out of the part of it that wasn't mine. I put the envelope back in the cedar box and slid it under the bed. I lay back on top of the covers with my boots still on and stared at the ceiling. The house settled around me. The wind moved through the birches along the fence line with a sound like water over stones. Somewhere out in the barn, one of the ewes made a brief low sound and then was still. I thought about Derek Moss standing in my kitchen, helping himself to a glass of water from my tap. I thought about Julian's thumbnail moving in small arcs against the handle of her coffee mug. I thought about Raymond sitting across this table for 40 years, always in the same chair, always with both hands around his mug. I thought about Nora standing in a lawyer's office 11 years ago, signing papers that would one day stand between this land and the people who wanted to take it, and not saying anything to me about it afterward beyond we should celebrate. So I had put a bottle of good cider on the table, and we had sat on the porch until it was too dark to see the fields. At 9:45, I picked up my phone and typed a message to Raymond. 8 o'clock tomorrow. Everything ready, he replied inside of a minute. I'll be there at 7:50. Simmons confirmed. Carol confirmed. Sleep if you can. I set the phone on the nightstand beside Nora's photograph. I reached over and turned off the lamp. The room went dark and I lay in it with the cedar box under the bed and the envelope inside it, and my hands folded on my chest, and I listened to the farm breathe around me, and I did not sleep for a long time. I was dressed by 5:30 and in the kitchen by 6, and the coffee was ready when Raymond's headlights came up the driveway at 7:49. He came in without knocking, the way he had always come in, the way a person comes into a house when the difference between knocking and not knocking stopped mattering years ago. He was wearing his good wool coat, the dark charcoal one he kept for occasions that required him to look like what he was. He took it off and hung it on the hook by the back door and sat down, and I poured him coffee without being asked, and we sat across from each other at the kitchen table in the gray early light and did not talk about what was going to happen in a few hours. We talked about his grandson instead, who had just started at the University of Vermont in Burlington and was apparently struggling with his first college chemistry course. Raymond said the boy had his mother's stubbornness and his father's optimism, which was not a useful combination for organic chemistry. I said it sounded like it might be useful for other things. Raymond agreed that it probably would be. At 8 o'clock exactly, Deputy Carol Stein's department vehicle came up the drive, followed by a dark gray sedan I didn't recognize. Both vehicles parked beside the barn. Stein came in through the back door with a man I hadn't met in person yet. Agent Roy Simmons, 50 years old, broad-shouldered and unhurried in the manner of someone who had been doing this long enough that the feeling of before had become routine. He wore a dark jacket over a collared shirt and carried a thin briefcase that he set on the kitchen counter without opening it. He shook my hand and Raymond's and accepted a cup of coffee and stood with it near the counter while Stein spread a single sheet of paper on the table. "Warrants are signed and in hand," she said, touching the paper without picking it up. "One for Derek Allen Moss, federal identity fraud, under 18. USC 1028, wire fraud, under 18. USC 1343, conspiracy. One for the fraudulent psychiatric filing coordinated with the state attorney's office. Judge Callahan signed both at 6 this morning." She looked at me. "The federal warrant covers the identity theft across state lines. That me and Simmons's piece. The state warrant covers the psychiatric fraud and the document forgery. That's mine." Simmons set his coffee mug down. "Mr. Calloway, I want to explain what's going to happen this morning so there are no surprises on your end." His voice was the voice of a man who gave this kind of briefing regularly and had learned that clarity was more useful than reassurance. "When the subjects arrive, we're going to let them make contact with you. We need them on the property on camera taking action consistent with the charges. Once Moss presents the guardianship documentation and makes a demand, we move. Deputy Stein's team will come in from the barn side. My partner and I will come in from the road. You don't need to do anything except be exactly where you normally would be." "At the kitchen table," I said. "At the kitchen table," he agreed. He and Stein went back outside. I watched through the window as they moved with quiet efficiency around the yard. Stein directing 2 uniformed deputies to positions behind the barn. Simmons speaking into a radio near his sedan. His partner, a younger woman in a dark jacket, was already at the far end of the driveway, positioned where she could see the road without being visible from it. The 2 department vehicles moved behind the barn and out of sight. The gray sedan stayed at the edge of the gravel near the tree line, angled so it could move quickly. Within 15 minutes, the yard looked exactly as it always did on a quiet Tuesday morning in October. Empty. Ordinary. Raymond was watching through the window beside me. He had his coffee mug in both hands. I noticed he had put on the charcoal wool coat again. "You don't have to stay in here," I said. "You could wait in the barn with Stein." "I'll stay," he said. We moved away from the window and sat back down at the table. I wrapped my hands around my mug. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but I drank it anyway. The clock above the stove read 8:47. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard, looked around, with the bright, suspicious attention crows brought to everything, and flew away again. At 9:03, I heard tires on gravel. Not one vehicle. 2. I kept my hands around the mug and did not look up from the table. Raymond, sitting across from me, raised his eyes to the window above my shoulder. Whatever he saw there, he kept off his face, but he set his coffee mug down very carefully and straightened in his chair. "Edward," he said quietly. "I know," I said. I heard car doors, more than two, four, maybe five, the sounds overlapping, the particular thud of doors that had been closed with purpose rather than consideration. Footsteps on the gravel, more than one set, moving toward the house. I looked down at my coffee mug. Nora had bought the set of mugs we used at a craft fair in Stowe the second summer after we moved here. Handmade local clay, a dark blue glaze with a thin line of white at the rim. I had been drinking from them for 29 years. I picked it up and took a slow sip. Then the knock came at the back door, 3 times, sharp and deliberate, nothing like the way Julian had knocked yesterday morning. I set the mug down and stood up. Before I reveal how this high-stakes confrontation ends and who finally gets exposed, drop the comment, "Still here," below, so I know you're riding this out with me. Also, please keep in mind, the upcoming events contain dramatized elements for storytelling and entertainment. If you prefer strictly non-fictional accounts, feel free to skip ahead or step away now. I opened the back door, and Derek Moss smiled at me. It was the smile of a man who believed he was standing on the winning side of something, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, because the eyes are already moving past you, into the room behind you, taking inventory. He was wearing a dark jacket over a blue-collared shirt, pressed, deliberate, dressed for a transaction, not a visit. Julian stood slightly behind his left shoulder. She was not smiling. Behind her were 2 men I didn't recognize, both in their 30s, both carrying the flat rectangular leather portfolios that said paralegal or junior associate, or someone who had been told to look official. "Edward," Derek said. His voice carried the particular warmth of someone who had decided in advance that warmth was the correct instrument for this moment. "I hope we're not catching you at a bad time." "Not at all," I said. "Come in." I stepped back and held the door, and they came through. Derek first, then the 2 men with their portfolios, then Julian last. She met my eyes for a fraction of a second as she passed me and then looked away. Her face had the look of someone moving through something they had committed to and were no longer able to turn back from. Derek crossed the kitchen with the ease of a man who had been picturing this room and what he was going to do inside it for a long time. He stopped near the table and looked around in a way that was meant to seem casual. It wasn't casual. It was the look I had seen on the camera footage, the look of someone assessing what was about to become theirs. "I appreciate you letting us come out," he said. "I know Julian mentioned you'd had some concerns about the paperwork, and I thought it might be easier if I came and walked you through everything in person." He nodded to one of the men with portfolios who opened his and extracted a bound document, maybe 12 pages, and placed it on the kitchen table. "This is the full guardianship petition. Everything is in order. We have the medical documentation, the psychiatric evaluation, and the financial assessment. Once you review it, we'll just need your acknowledgement that the process is moving forward." He said acknowledgement the way people say it, when they mean something closer to compliance. I looked at the document on the table without touching it. "A guardianship petition," I said. "It's a standard conservatorship filing," Derek said. His voice stayed even and pleasant. "The court appoints someone, in this case Julian, as your daughter and closest family member, to assist with financial and medical decisions. It's designed to protect you, Edward. Given some of the concerns about my cognitive state," I said, "we just want to make sure you're taken care of." He said it the way you say something you have practiced until the original meaning has been worn smooth. He gestured toward the chair at the head of the table. "Why don't you sit down? We can go through it together." I looked at Julian. She was standing near the hallway entrance, her arms crossed, her weight shifted slightly toward the door. Not the posture of a daughter who had come to help her father. The posture of someone who wanted to be closer to an exit than to the table. "I appreciate you coming all the way out here," I said to Derek. I picked up the document from the table and turned it over once in my hands, the way I had turned the manila envelope 2 days ago, and then I set it back down. "Give me just one moment." I turned and walked toward the back hallway toward the bedroom, moving at the pace I always moved. Unhurried, a 72-year-old man in his own house. Behind me, I heard Derek shift his weight, heard one of the portfolio men murmur something, heard the particular sound of people who have been waiting for something and are trying to decide whether this is a detour or a problem. I walked down the hallway. I did not go into the bedroom. I stopped at the hallway mirror, straightened my collar, and looked at my own reflection for one moment. Then I walked back to the kitchen doorway and stepped through it. Deputy Carol Stein was standing in the yard outside the back door, which she had come through while I was in the hallway. She was in full uniform, one hand resting on her belt, and behind her, through the doorway, I could see Agent Simmons and his partner coming around the side of the barn. A second deputy was visible near the tree line at the edge of the driveway. Derek Moss turned from the window, where he had been watching for me to come back from the bedroom. The expression on his face moved through 3 distinct stages in less than 2 seconds. Confusion, first, then a rapid and visible recalculation, then something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it in the way that cold is adjacent to pain. "Derek Allen Moss," Stein said. Her voice was level and carried clearly in the morning air. "I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of identity fraud and wire fraud, and a state warrant on charges of conspiracy to commit financial fraud and filing of fraudulent legal documentation." She stepped through the doorway into the kitchen. "Please keep your hands where I can see them." Derek's hands came up slowly. He looked at Julian. Julianne had both arms wrapped around herself, her hands gripping her own elbows, her face the color of the October sky outside drained flat. The look of someone watching a structure they built collapse from the inside out. Then Derek looked at me. I was standing in the kitchen doorway with my hands at my sides. I looked back at him without saying anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. Simmons and his partner moved into the kitchen with the efficient economy of people who had done this many times and had learned that speed and calm were not opposites. The partner, a woman in her mid-30s whose name I would later learn, was Agent Dana Reyes, positioned herself near the hallway entrance while Simmons crossed to Derek directly. The 2 men with the leather portfolios had been guided to the far side of the kitchen by the second deputy, where they stood looking at each other with the expressions of people who had been hired for a professional task and had just discovered the nature of that task was considerably different from what they had been told. Stein continued reading from the warrant document clearly and without rushing, covering the full list of charges. As she read, Simmons produced a set of handcuffs, and Derek's hands came down from where they had been raised and moved behind his back, and Simmons secured them with the particular practiced motion that made it look almost unremarkable, like something that happened every day in kitchens in Vermont. Which somewhere it probably did. Derek said nothing during this. He was watching Stein read his jaw, set his eyes moving with a calculation that hadn't stopped even now. I recognized the quality of that calculation. I had seen it on the footage in my kitchen when he stood at the counter, helping himself to my water and talking about what he was going to take. Even here, even with his hands behind his back, Derek Moss was running numbers. When Stein finished, she folded the document and looked at him. "Do you understand the charges as read?" "I understand that there's been a significant misunderstanding," Derek said. His voice was still controlled, still carrying the residue of the warmth he had walked in with 20 minutes ago. "I'd like to speak with my attorney before anyone says anything further." You'll have that opportunity, Stein said. Agent Simmons will advise you of your rights. Simmons began. Derek listened with his eyes fixed somewhere above Stein's left shoulder, the way a person listens to something they have decided in advance not to engage with. When Simmons finished, Derek turned his head and looked at Julian. She was still near the hallway entrance, still with her arms wrapped around herself, and whatever she had been holding together since she walked through the back door was visibly coming apart now. Her face had gone from drained to something that looked like the early stages of shock. The slightly unfocused eyes, the shallow breathing. The way her weight had shifted back against the wall, as though the wall was the only thing keeping her upright. Derek looked at her for a long moment. Then he said clearly, and with a precision that told me it was not impulsive. This was Julian's idea, all of it. The paperwork, the doctor coming out here today. I was trying to help her. I didn't fully understand what she was asking me to do. The kitchen went very still. Julian's arms dropped from around herself. She stared at him. Her mouth opened and then closed, and then she said his name, just his name, Derek, one word. The way you say someone's name when you are trying to understand something that isn't making sense yet. You told me your father needed help managing his affairs, Derek said to her. His voice was the voice of a reasonable man, patiently clarifying a misunderstanding. You told me he'd been confused. You came to me with concerns. I tried to help you find solutions. If those solutions turned out to be problematic, that's not something I was aware of. Derek. Julian's voice had changed. The flatness was gone, and what was underneath it was rawer than I had expected. Not rage, not yet, but something that sounded like the first moment of a much larger understanding. You know that isn't what happened. I know what you told me, he said. And then he stopped talking because his attorney somewhere had told him where the line was, and he had found it. Simmons reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document which he opened and held toward Derek. Mr. Moss, this is a copy of a flight booking made in your name yesterday morning. Burlington International Airport, departing in approximately 50 hours destination, Sao Paulo, Brazil, with no return flight. Would you like to explain that? Derek looked at the document. The calculation behind his eyes ran for another 2 seconds, and then, for the first time since he had walked through my back door, it stopped. Not because he had found the answer, because he had run out of numbers. Raymond, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway behind me since Stein came in, spoke for the first time. Sao Paulo doesn't have an extradition treaty that covers wire fraud, he said. His voice was conversational, the tone of a man noting something mildly interesting. In case that was part of the thinking. Nobody responded to that. There wasn't much to say to it. The second deputy and Agent Reyes moved Derek toward the back door. He went without resisting, which I had not expected, and without looking at me, which I had. Julian watched him go. She tracked him all the way to the door and through it, and then she stood in the kitchen staring at the space where he had been, her hands hanging at her sides. The early October light coming through the window above the sink and falling across the kitchen table where the guardianship petition was still sitting in its bound cover, 12 pages of careful, fraudulent language that had never had a chance of doing what it was designed to do. Outside through the window, I watched the deputy guide Derek toward the department vehicle. He moved with his shoulders slightly forward, his head down, and he did not look back at the farmhouse. Not once. The man who had stood in my kitchen 6 weeks ago talking about what he was going to take from me walked out of my yard without looking at any of it. Julian made a sound that was not quite a word. I turned from the window. She was still standing in the same place. Her face had completed the journey it had been making since the handcuffs went on past shock, past the moment of understanding, into something quieter and more desolate. Her eyes found mine across the kitchen. Dad, she said. Her voice had nothing left in it to perform with. The kitchen had emptied out, the way rooms do after something irreversible. The deputies gone, Simmons and his partner gone, the two men with the portfolios gone with them, the guardianship petition still sitting on the table, where nobody had thought to take it yet. Raymond had stepped outside with Stein giving me the room, the way Raymond always knew when to give me a room. And now it was just Julian and me, and the ordinary October light coming through the windows and the coffee that had gone cold on the counter an hour ago. Julian hadn't moved from where she was standing. Her arms were at her sides now, hands open, and she was looking at the kitchen floor, the way you look at something when you aren't actually seeing it, when your eyes need somewhere to point, while your mind is somewhere else entirely. "Dad," she said again. The word came out the same way it had the first time, stripped of everything that wasn't necessary, no inflection, no angle to it, just the word itself. I pulled out the chair closest to her, on my chair, not the chair across from mine, but the one beside her, Nora's chair, and I sat down in it, not across the table from her, beside her. She looked at me when I did that. Something moved across her face that I couldn't entirely name. Surprise maybe, or the particular kind of pain that comes when someone does something gentle at a moment when you have stopped expecting gentleness. She sat down in the next chair. Her hands came up onto the table, and she looked at them, and I saw it then, what I had missed in all the days she had been coming and going from this house, what the lighting and the distance and perhaps my own unwillingness to look directly at the possibility had kept me from seeing. On her left wrist, just below the heel of her hand, there was a bruise. Not fresh yellowed at the edges, the way bruises go when they are a week or 10 days old, the color of old mustard, irregular in shape. The kind of mark that comes from fingers, from a grip. I looked at it for a moment, and then I looked away at the table, at the grain of the wood I had looked at for 30 years. Behind me, the back door opened and closed quietly. Stein's voice low. "Edward." I turned slightly. She was standing just inside the door, and she had the look she got when she was about to say something she had been waiting to find the right moment for. "I need to tell you something before you and Julian talk. We pulled her emergency room records as part of the investigation. 2 visits in the past 18 months. She told the attending physician both times that she'd fallen." Stein paused. "The attending noted in both records that the injury patterns were inconsistent with the reported cause. She declined further inquiry both times." Another pause. "I thought you should know." I nodded. Stein went back outside. I turned back to Julian. She had heard all of it. She was looking at her hands on the table, at the bruise on her left wrist, with an expression that was not shame exactly, but was in the same neighborhood, the look of something long hidden that had just been uncovered in front of the one person you most dreaded uncovering it. "How long?" I said. It came out quietly, not as an accusation. She didn't answer right away. The clock above the stove marked the seconds. Outside, a car started and pulled away down the road. "About a year," she said. "Maybe a little more." I put my hand flat on the table between us. Not on her hand. Just near it on the wood. "Why didn't you tell me?" She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite a cry, and was somehow both. "Because I'd already been telling you to sell your house, Dad. I didn't think I had a lot of credibility left. That hit somewhere I hadn't expected." I sat with it for a moment before I answered. "Those are separate things," I said. "What Derek did to you and what you did here, those are separate things. They don't cancel each other out in either direction." She nodded very slowly, the way people nod when they understand something intellectually before they can feel it. "I knew something was wrong with him," she said. Her voice had found a different register now, quieter, more careful, like she was testing the weight of each word before she said it. Not right away. At first I believed what he showed me, but somewhere in the middle of it I knew, and I kept going anyway. She looked at the window. I told myself it was too late to stop, that I'd already come too far. I think what I really meant was that I was scared of what he'd do if I tried. I looked at my daughter. I looked at the bruise on her wrist. I looked at the woman across from me who had come into this house 3 days ago with a plan that had hurt me and had stood in this kitchen and let a man use her to try to take what Nora and I had spent our lives building. And I tried to hold all of that at the same time without letting any of it collapse into simple feeling. "You're going to have to answer for what you did," I said. "A lawyer, a court process, whatever comes next, that's real, and I can't change it, and I wouldn't if I could." I kept my voice level because I meant every word, and I needed her to hear them clearly. "But I want you to understand something. When this is over, all of it, however long it takes, there's still going to be a door here. It's not going to be the same door it was, but it's going to be there." She pressed her lips together very hard for a moment. Her eyes went bright, and then she looked at the table and blinked several times. "Dad," she said for the third time. This time it sounded different than the first two. I stood up. I reached into the inside pocket of my flannel shirt and took out the envelope cream-colored Nora's handwriting on the front. The cedar box under my bed for 2 years, and now here in my hand in the morning light of this kitchen. I set it on the table in front of her. She looked at it. I watched her recognize the handwriting. Her right hand moved toward it and stopped an inch away, trembling slightly, as though the envelope might not be real if she touched it. "Your mother wrote that before she died," I said. "She told me I'd know when to give it to you." I looked at her one more time. "Read it." I had kept that envelope for 2 years and 3 months. I had moved it from the nightstand to the cedar box under the bed the week after Nora died, because having it on the nightstand felt like keeping something between us that was meant for someone else. I had taken it out perhaps a dozen times in those 2 years, held it, turned it over, set it back. Once, about 8 months after she passed, I had gotten as far as sliding my thumbnail under the flap before I stopped. Nora had said it wasn't for me, and she had said it with the particular directness that meant she wasn't negotiating the point. I had put it back in the cedar box and not taken it out again until last night. Julian was looking at the envelope the way she had been looking at it since I set it down, with her right hand still an inch away from it, trembling slightly, as though the distance between her fingers and the paper was the last thing she had control over, and she wasn't ready to give it up yet. "She wrote this herself." Julian's voice was barely above a whisper. "Sitting up in bed," I said. "About 2 weeks before she died. She asked me to leave the room while she wrote it. When I came back in, she had it sealed and she gave it to me and told me what she told me." I paused. I kept my word. Julian's fingers closed the remaining inch and touched the envelope. She ran her thumb across her mother's handwriting. "For Julian, when she needs it, the way you touch something you are not sure is real." Her jaw was tight, and her eyes were very bright, and she was doing the particular thing she had done since she was a child, when she was trying not to cry in front of me, which was to focus very hard on a fixed point and breathe through her nose. She was not entirely successful. I stood up from Nora's chair. I buttoned the top button of my flannel shirt, the way I did when I was going outside, a habit. So old it had stopped being conscious. I looked at the top of Julian's head, her dark hair, the same dark hair she'd had since she was born, the same hair Nora used to braid on Sunday mornings at this table, while Julian ate her cereal and complained that it was too tight. "Take whatever time you need," I said. I walked to the back door. I did not look back. Not because I didn't want to, I did want to more than I would have been able to explain to anyone. but because the letter was between Julian and her mother, and I had spent 2 years staying out of it, and I was not going to stop now when it mattered most. I opened the door and stepped out into the October morning. Raymond was standing on the far side of the yard, near the fence line, hands in the pockets of his charcoal coat, looking out at the east field, the way he looked at things when he was giving them the full attention they deserved. He heard the door and turned, and I walked across the yard to where he was standing, and we stood together at the fence line, without talking for a while. The fields ran out ahead of us, brown and gold, the birch trees along the north fence still holding a few yellow leaves that the morning wind moved in slow arcs. A thin line of cloud was breaking up to the west, and where it broke the sky was the particular pale blue that Vermont produced in October, like something it had been saving. Behind me, through this closed kitchen door, I heard Julian begin to cry. Not the controlled, effortful sound from inside the house a few minutes ago. This was different, the kind of crying that happens when something that has been held for a very long time is finally allowed to move, the kind that has no performance in it, because there is no one left to perform for. It came through the door and across the yard, and I stood at the fence line, and I listened to it, and I did not go back inside. Raymond stood beside me. He did not say anything. He did not put a hand on my shoulder or offer a word meant to make the moment smaller than it was. He just stood there the way he had been standing beside me at various fence lines for 40 years and let the moment be what it was. After a while, the sound from inside the house changed. Not stopped, changed. The sharp, breaking quality of it softened into something steadier, and then steadier still, until it was something I could no longer clearly hear from where I was standing. "She wrote a good letter," I said. I didn't know that. I had never read it. But I knew Nora. I knew that whatever she had put in that envelope she had chosen, with the same care she brought to everything that mattered to her, and I had no doubt that it was enough. That it was what Julian needed. Raymond looked at me. "How do you know? You said you never opened it." "I don't," I said, "but Nora wrote it." "So." Raymond considered that for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when something was true enough to not require further discussion. The wind moved through the birches. A crow went over low and purposeful, heading toward the tree line on the far side of the north pasture. The thin western cloud finished breaking apart, and the pale blue behind it widened, and the morning light changed, became cleaner the way light does when something that was obscuring it moves away. I put both hands on the top fence rail and looked out at the land. 31 years, I had been looking at this view from various points around the property, from the barn, from the back porch, from this fence line, from the cab of the tractor in the early mornings. 31 years of seasons on this particular piece of Vermont, this exact arrangement of fields and tree lines and hills. Nora had loved it in a way she never entirely put into words, which was how Nora loved the things she loved most, without narrating it, just by being here, by building things here, by making sure it would still be here when she was gone. The back door opened behind me. I didn't turn around immediately. I gave Julian the moment to cross the yard and decide where she wanted to stand. I heard her footsteps on the grass, slow and uneven. The way footsteps are after crying, and then she stopped a few feet away. Raymond looked at me. I turned around. Julian was holding the open letter in both hands. Her face was what crying leaves behind, not ruined, not broken, but changed in the specific way that things are changed when something long compressed is finally released. She looked at me across the yard, with her mother's letter in her hands, and her eyes still wet, and she said, "She knew." "She usually did," I said. Julian looked down at the letter and then back at me. "She says she loves you," she said. Her voice was rough but steady. "She wanted me to tell you. She said she knew you wouldn't read it, so she wanted me to tell you the part. I put my hands in my pockets. The pale blue October sky sat above the fields and the birch trees and the fence line, and all of it enormous and indifferent and very beautiful. "Okay," I said. People asked me afterward how I felt. Not right away in the days immediately following. People were too busy with the practical machinery of what had happened to ask how I felt about it. There were calls with Stein, calls with Simmons, calls with Patricia Cross about what the next several months would look like from a legal standpoint. There was a deposition 2 hours in a conference room in Montpellier with a federal prosecutor who was thorough and not unkind, and who asked me the same questions 6 different ways until she was satisfied that my answers were consistent, which they were because they were true. There was a reporter from the Burlington Free Press who called twice and whom I did not call back. But after a few weeks, when the immediate machinery had done what it needed to do and things had settled into the slower rhythm of legal processes that move on their own timeline regardless of what anyone wants, people started asking. Friends from town. The man who delivered my feed. The woman who cut my hair in Montpellier every 6 weeks. "How do you feel, Edward? Are you doing all right?" I told them I felt fine, which was not entirely accurate, but was close enough to true that I didn't feel dishonest saying it. What I actually felt was something I struggled to find a word for. Not vindicated, that word implied I had been waiting to be proven right, and I hadn't been waiting for that. Not relieved, relief suggested the removal of a fear, and what I had mostly felt for the past 3 months was not fear, but a particular focused clarity, and that hadn't changed. What I felt, if I was being honest with myself in the early mornings at the kitchen table before anyone called, was something closer to the feeling, after a long structural repair, the specific quiet of a thing that has been fixed and is holding not triumphant, just sound. Derek Allen Moss had been remanded to federal custody without bail. The magistrate at his arraignment had cited the one-way international flight booking as evidence of flight risk and declined to set bail entirely. His attorney had argued. The magistrate had not been persuaded. The federal case was proceeding on its own timeline, which Simmons had told me straightforwardly meant a minimum of 8 to 14 months before trial. Dr. Paul Hensley had entered into a cooperation agreement with the state attorney's office. In exchange for his testimony and the evidence he had provided, he would not face criminal prosecution, but the Vermont Board of Medical Practice had opened a disciplinary proceeding against his license. His attorney told Patricia Cross, who told me that Hensley expected to lose it. He had told his attorney he understood that and accepted it. I didn't know what to do with that information except to file it in the category of things that were between Paul Hensley and his own conscience. Julian had been charged with 2 counts, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, and 1 count related to the substance placed in the food she had brought to the farm. She had retained an attorney in Burlington, a woman named Carol Ashworth, who had 20 years of experience in the criminal courts and a reputation, according to Raymond, for being extremely effective at presenting context to juries. The cooperation Julian was providing to both the federal and state investigations, her account of Derek's methods, the communications she had preserved on her phone over 18 months, the documentation of what he had asked her to do, and when was Ashworth had indicated likely to result in a significantly reduced outcome. Raymond had said when I asked him directly that he thought it unlikely Julian would serve prison time. I had not told him how I felt about that. I wasn't entirely sure how I felt about it. Gloria Marsh came by the farm on a Wednesday morning in late October, driving her old Subaru wagon up the drive the way she had driven it to this property for 20 years. She was 70 years old and had lived in the farmhouse a quarter-mile down the road since before I bought this place, and she brought a loaf of her zucchini bread, the way she brought it whenever she felt something needed to be marked. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and told me she had given a USB drive to Stein weeks ago, footage from the security camera she'd kept running on her front porch since a break-in 2 winters back, the kind that covered the road and the end of my driveway. She'd seen Julian arrive late that first night and had thought nothing of it until Stein came by asking questions. She hadn't heard anything since and wanted to make sure it had been useful. I told her it had been very useful. She nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting to hear that and was glad to have it confirmed. Tom Whitfield came by 2 days later, a Friday, stopping on his way home from Montpellier in the late afternoon when the light was doing what it did in Vermont in late October, going gold and long across the fields before it dropped. He brought a folder of paperwork, the completed credit bureau notifications, the formal dispute filings that would begin the process of clearing my name from the 3 fraudulent accounts Derek had opened. He walked me through each document, explained what I needed to sign and what the timeline looked like, and declined coffee because he had to get back to his family before dark. He shook my hand at the door with both of his and said he was glad it had come out right. After he left, I stood at the kitchen window for a while and watched the last of the afternoon light move across the east field. The birch trees had lost most of their leaves, now standing bare and white against the darker tree line behind them, clean and without pretension, exactly what they were. Raymond called that evening. He told me the federal prosecutor had reached out to his office about his eyewitness account from the morning of the 6th, and that he had given a full written statement. He asked how I was doing, in the way he asked when he actually wanted to know rather than when he was being courteous. I told him the truth, which was that I was doing better than I expected, and also more tired than I expected, and that most evenings I sat on the porch for a while before dark and looked at the fields and felt something that didn't have a clean name but wasn't bad. He said that sounded about right. After we hung up, I walked through the house the way I sometimes walked through it in the evenings, not restlessly, just present in it, moving through the rooms that Nora and I had filled over 31 years with the accumulated weight of an ordinary life. I stopped in the kitchen and looked at the windowsill above the sink. Nora's photograph was there. The one from Lake Champlain, the summer she almost dropped her ice cream cone. The boot print was long gone. She was smiling the way she had always smiled, with her whole face, like she had decided the thing in front of her was worth her full attention. I put my hand briefly on the edge of the windowsill below the photograph. I kept my promise, I said. Pastor Gene Holloway had been the minister at the First Congregational Church in town for 19 years, and in that time he had developed the particular skill of knowing when a visit was wanted and when it was needed, and which of those 2 things was actually being requested. He drove out to the farm on a Thursday morning in mid-October in his old Jeep Cherokee, parked it beside the barn without being asked to, and came to the back door with nothing in his hands. No casserole, no flowers, no book of verses someone had pressed on him to pass along. Just Gene, 65 years old, in his canvas jacket and work boots, which told me he had come as a neighbor and not as a pastor, which was the version of him I had always preferred. I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table the way people sit when they have known each other long enough that the table itself is part of the conversation. Gene had known me since Nora and I joined the church 28 years ago. He had preached at Nora's funeral. He had come out to the farm the following week and sat in this same chair and not said anything pastoral, which was the most pastoral thing he could have done. He didn't mention the events of the past weeks directly. He asked about the ewes, whether the older one had come back to her feed. She had, I told him. He asked whether the fence post on the east field had been replaced yet. It hadn't, I told, but I had the materials in the barn and would get to it before the first snow. He nodded and drank his coffee and looked out the window at the fields with the easy attention of a man who had grown up in this kind of country and never found anything to apologize for in looking at it. After a while, he said, "What are you going to do with all the quiet, Edward?" It was the kind of question Jean asked, not what are your plans, not how are you holding up, but something that went at the thing from a different angle and required an actual answer rather than a social one. I thought about it. Outside the fields ran gold and brown to the tree line, the birch trees stripped bare now, standing white and clean in the thin October light. A pair of Canada geese went over low and purposeful, heading south, in the particular unhurried way that geese had, as though they had looked at the calendar and found it satisfactory. "I'm going to stay in it for a while," I said. "The quiet. I've been moving fast for 3 months. I think I owe myself a slower season." Jean nodded slowly, the way he nodded when something was close to what he was looking for, but not quite all of it. "And after the slower season, I'll find something that needs fixing," I said. "I usually do." He almost smiled at that. "You always have," he said. "Nora used to say that about you, that you could find the thing that needed fixing in any room you walked into." "She meant it as a criticism sometimes," I said. "Only sometimes," Jean said. We sat for a while with that. And it was the comfortable kind of sitting, the kind that didn't require filling. The clock above the stove marked time. The furnace cycled on in the basement, and then off again. Through the window, the light shifted slightly as a thin cloud moved across the sun and then moved away. Raymond called at 11:30. I excused myself and took the phone to the front hallway, and Jean refilled his own coffee from the pot on the counter, which told me he had been in this kitchen enough times to know where things were, and that he was welcome to them. Raymond's voice had the particular quality it got when he was delivering information he had been sitting with for a day or two. He told me the federal prosecutor's office had confirmed the preliminary hearing for Derek's case was scheduled for the second week of December. He told me Julian's attorney had filed the cooperation documentation with both the state and federal offices, and that the response from both had been, in Carol Ashworth's word, encouraging. He told me that Hensley's disciplinary hearing before the Vermont Board of Medical Practice was set for January. "How is she doing?" I said. I didn't need to specify who I meant. Raymond paused, not the pause of someone who didn't know the answer, but the pause of someone deciding how much of what they knew to share. "Carol Ashworth says she's engaged with the process, showing up doing the work." Another pause. "She asked Ashworth whether you'd received her letter." I looked at the hallway wall at the row of coat hooks Nora had installed. The first winter we were here, the same hooks that still held the same 2 jackets, in the same order they had always hung. "What did Ashworth say?" "She said she didn't know. Carol thought you'd want to know, she asked." "I'll tell Carol," Raymond said, and I could hear in his voice that he was not going to comment on the slip, which was the correct decision. "Take care of yourself, Edward." "You too," I said. I went back to the kitchen. Jean was at the window, mug in both hands, looking out at the east field with the expression of a man who found the view worth looking at and wasn't in a hurry to stop. "I should let you get on with your day," he said, without turning from the window. "You're not keeping me from anything," I said. He turned then and looked at me with the directness that had always been the thing I respected most about him, not the sermons, not the ceremonies, but the moments when he just looked at you like you were worth looking at clearly. "You did right by this place, Edward," he said, "and by Nora. She'd have thought so." I didn't have an answer for that wouldn't have required more words than the moment needed. So I nodded, and Jean set his mug in the sink and pulled on his canvas jacket and went out the back door, and I heard his Jeep start and crunch down the gravel drive and turn onto the road. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then I went to the front of the house to check the mailbox the way I checked it every day around noon. There was a utility bill. A seed catalog I hadn't ordered the same company that sent them every October, and a plain white envelope with no return address, the handwriting on the front, careful and slightly uneven, the postmark from a facility in Burlington I recognized from the paperwork Stein had given me 6 weeks ago. I stood at the end of the driveway holding the envelope and looked at my name written in my daughter's handwriting. Then I walked back to the house. I left the letter on the kitchen table for 3 days, not because I was avoiding it, or not only because of that. Partly because I had learned in 72 years that the things that mattered most were rarely improved by being rushed, and partly because having it there on the table unopened felt like something I wasn't ready to give up yet. A possibility still in its envelope. The way a seed catalog in January is not really about seeds. It sits there on the counter, and you walk past it every morning, and it holds something warmth maybe, or the idea of warmth that disappears the moment you open it and find out what's actually inside. I walked past it every morning when I made coffee. I looked at it when I sat down for meals. I did not pick it up again after the first night, when I had held it for a while, and then set it back down in the same spot, because the spot had become its spot, in the way that things acquire belonging when they stay somewhere long enough. On the fourth morning, I sat down at the table with my coffee, pulled the envelope toward me, and opened it. Julian's handwriting was not Nora's handwriting. Nora had written in a clear, upright hand every letter formed completely, the kind of handwriting that suggested a person who thought carefully before committing to something. Julian's handwriting had always been more hurried, the letters leaning forward as though they were trying to get somewhere. The handwriting in this letter was different from both, slower than Julian's usual, more deliberate, the letters formed with the particular care of someone who had written the same sentence several times before settling on this version. The letter was 2 pages front and back, written on lined paper torn from a notebook. She did not begin with an apology. She said she had started the letter 3 times with one and thrown all 3 versions away because an apology at the beginning felt like she was asking for something, and she was not writing to ask for anything. She said she was writing because she needed to say some things out loud, or as close to out loud as a letter could get, and because she thought I deserved to hear them regardless of whether they changed anything between us. She said she had understood somewhere in the middle of everything that she had stopped seeing me. Not stopped loving me, she was careful about that distinction, and I was glad she was careful about it, but stopped seeing me. Stopped seeing the person who had driven through the night when she called, who had shown up without being asked, who had built and repaired and tended this place for 31 years, because he believed that the things you built with your hands were worth the time they took. She said she had let someone else's voice become louder than her own memory of who I was, and that was a failure she intended to carry honestly rather than explain away. She said she had opened her mother's letter. She did not tell me what it said. She said she didn't think she could not yet, and maybe not for a long time, and that she hoped I understood that. She said she had read it 4 times in the first hour, and that it had done something to her that she didn't have words for yet, but that she thought it would take the rest of her life to fully understand it, and that she was grateful to have the rest of her life in which to try. Near the end of the 2nd page, her handwriting changed slightly. Got smaller the way handwriting gets when someone is being very precise about something. She wrote, "I keep thinking about the summer. I was 10 years old, and you let me help you lay the brick path along the south side of the barn. Do you remember that? You had me start at the corner post, and when I asked why that corner and not some other place, you said the first brick had to be exactly right, because everything after it would follow from it. I didn't understand what you meant then. I think I'm starting to understand it now. I'm trying to figure out where my first brick is, Dad. I think that's the work." I set the letter down. I remembered that summer clearly. Julian had been 10, which meant it was before Nora's diagnosis, before the years, when everything became organized around doctors and appointments and the particular kind of waiting that sits in a house when someone inside it is running out of time. That summer had been ordinary, in the way that only summers you can't know are ending ever are. Julian had worn the same red sneakers for 3 months straight and complained about everything and followed me around the property with the tireless curiosity of a child who has not yet decided that adults are not worth watching. She had carried bricks for 2 hours without being asked to stop. She had asked me the same question about the corner post twice because she wanted to make sure she understood the answer. I had forgotten that I told her that. I had not forgotten the day. I sat at the table for a long time, with my hands flat on the wood, and the letter in front of me, and the morning coming through the windows. The way October mornings came in Vermont sideways and gold, the light doing something particular with the bare birch branches along the fence line that made them look like lines drawn carefully against the sky. A pair of chickadees worked the branches of the old apple tree at the edge of the yard, methodical and unbothered, finding what they needed without making a production of it. Then I folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. I carried it to the bedroom and placed it in the cedar box beside the space where Nora's envelope had been for 2 years before I gave it away. The cedar box had held one thing for a long time. Now it held another. I thought that was probably right. I thought Nora would have thought so too. I put on my flannel shirt and my work jacket and went out to the barn and got the post driver and the wire stretcher and the new post I had cut from the materials I had been keeping since September, and I spent the morning replacing the fence post on the east field. The work was straightforward: dig out the old post, which had been leaning at an angle that would not have survived the first serious snow tamp, the new one in level. Check it with the small torpedo level I kept in my jacket pocket, restring the wire in 3 runs, and tighten it until it sang when you plucked it, which was how you knew it was right. My hands knew what they were doing without being told. They had been doing this kind of thing for 30 years. There was a particular quality to the work when you had done something long enough, not ease exactly, but a kind of conversation between you and the task that didn't require thinking about, in the way that new things required thinking about. By noon the post was in, and the wire was tight, and the section of fence that had been leaning for 2 months was standing straight again. I stood back and looked at it the way I always looked at a finished repair, not with pride exactly, but with the particular satisfaction of a problem that had been correctly solved. The post stood the way a post was supposed to stand. It would hold through the winter. That was what it was supposed to do, and it was going to do it. I walked back to the house and left my boots on the porch mat Nora had put there 30 years ago and went inside and washed my hands at the kitchen sink. Through the window above the sink, Nora smiled at me from the photograph on the sill, the one from Lake Champlain, the summer she nearly dropped her ice cream cone. The same smile she had always had. Patient and complete, like she had already seen how this was going to go and had decided it was all right. I dried my hands and poured a fresh cup of coffee and carried it to the back porch. I sat down in the chair on the left, my chair, the one I had always used, and looked out at the east field at the new fence post standing straight and white against the dark soil at the hills beyond it, going gold and rust in the October afternoon, at the sky above all of it, wide and pale and indifferent, in the way that only very large things can afford to be. I thought about Julian finding her first brick. I thought about Nora building a wall nobody knew was there until the day it was needed. I thought about Raymond driving down from Burlington in the dark because a friend called and said, "Come early." I thought about 40 years of marriages and friendships and choices and repairs, and how none of the things worth having had arrived quickly or easily or without cost, and how the cost was usually the point rather than the obstacle. The fence post I had put in that morning had cost me 3 hours and a sore lower back and a set of wire-cut calluses I would feel for the next week. It was also going to stand through every storm Vermont could produce between now and spring. Those two things were not unrelated. The coffee was good. The afternoon light was doing what it did in Vermont in October, going long and gold across the fields before it dropped, making ordinary things look briefly like more than they were. A crow went over the same crow or a different one. I had been watching crows cross this piece of sky for 3 decades and had never once been able to tell them apart, purposeful and unhurried heading somewhere it had already decided on. I wrapped both hands around the mug. I had a fence post in the ground. I had a letter in a cedar box. I had a farm that was going to need tending through the winter, and a ewe that had come back to her feed, and a friend who drove down from Burlington without asking why, and a daughter who was trying to find her first brick in the rubble of the choices she had made. It was enough. It was in fact considerably more than enough. I sat on the porch and watched the afternoon light move across the land, and I let the day be exactly what it was. I spent 31 years building and repairing things with my hands. I thought I understood what it meant to fix something. What I didn't understand, not until I was standing in my own kitchen watching everything come apart, was that the most important structures we build are not the ones made of wood and wire and stone. They are the ones made of trust, of presence, of showing up when it costs you something. Those are the grandpa stories nobody tells until it's almost too late. I am not a perfect man. I held my secrets too long. I waited when I should have spoken. If you are reading the distance growing between you and someone you love, do not do what I did. Do not wait for the ground to give way before you say the thing that needs saying. That is my one piece of advice offered by a man who learned it the hard way on a Vermont farm at 72 years old. I believe God puts certain people in our path at exactly the right moment, Raymond, Nora, even Julian in the end. Every family story worth telling has that thread running through it, if you look closely enough. These grandpa stories, these family stories, they are not really about property or betrayal or courtrooms. They are about whether we can find our way back to each other before it is too late. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us. There is always another story worth telling. Thank you for staying until the end. The stories that follow contain fictional elements crafted for the purpose of reflection and understanding. If that is not what you are looking for today, we respect that completely, and we hope you find exactly what you need.